The last hug my mother gave me still felt warm on my shoulders, but the first text my brother sent me was as cold as a stone. I had spent the last 6 months watching the only woman in our family who ever truly saw me fade away in a Chicago hospital room. Now, on the 4-hour flight back to our childhood home in Pennsylvania, I texted the family group chat. Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up? My phone buzzed almost immediately, and I felt that stupid flicker of hope. Right before I read my brother Leo's reply, "Me and Dad are busy clearing out the garage. Just get an Uber, the firm will cover it." I stared at the screen, at that corporate offer to pay for my abandonment, not yet realizing that their carelessness had done more than just leave me stranded. It had left the door to my mother's house wide open for the real nightmare to begin. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Clara. The last hug my mother gave me was in the harshly lit corridor of a Chicago hospital, a place that smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair. It had been a fierce, brittle embrace, a final transfer of strength from a body that had none left to give. Now, the lingering warmth of it on the fabric of my coat was a ghost I clung to, a phantom pressure against my shoulders. It was my only comfort during the 4-hour flight back to Pennsylvania, a journey that felt less like traveling across states and more like crossing a desolate ocean, away from the clinical world where her life had drawn to a close and toward the vacant space that was once our family home. The plane's engines whined, the vibration running through my bones as we began our descent. Through the small, scratched window, the familiar gray clouds of late autumn blanketed the landscape, a sky the color of a bruise. I pulled out my phone, my fingers feeling clumsy and disconnected from my brain. I opened the family group chat, a digital room that had grown cold and silent over the past 6 months, punctuated only by my brief clinical updates about Mom's condition. My thumbs hovered over the keyboard. It felt pathetic to even ask, a concession of need I had been taught to suppress, but I was so tired. A deep cellular exhaustion that grief had ground into my very marrow. I typed the words, each one a small, hopeful prayer sent into the void. "Flight lands at 5 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" My phone buzzed almost instantly in my hand. For a foolish, fragile second, my heart leaped. Hope is a stubborn, irrational weed, pushing its way through the most desolate soil. Then I read the reply from my older brother. "Leo, me and Dad are busy clearing out the garage. Just get an Uber. The firm will cover it." The words hung there on the screen. So sterile, so efficient. The firm will cover it. He hadn't offered an apology or a moment of his time. He had offered a solution from his corporate expense account, reducing my return to a logistical problem to be outsourced. It was a transaction meant to absolve him of the actual human effort of showing up. Before I could even process the familiar sting of his casual dismissal, a second message popped up beneath his. It was from my father, Richard. "You know how it is, honey. Leo has that big project. Best not to disturb him." Reading his words, I saw the family dynamic laid bare. The entire solar system of our lives revolved around the sun of Leo's career, and I was just a distant, forgotten planet. I leaned my head against the cold plastic of the window, watching the world rush up to meet me. I had whispered a promise to my mother in her final lucid moments, a promise to look after Dad, to keep the frayed threads of our family from snapping completely. But as I stared at those two messages, I understood with a chilling clarity that I was returning to a well that had run dry a long, long time ago. I had just been too busy, too hopeful, to notice. The rideshare driver, a man named George with kind, weary eyes, met me by the baggage claim. He took my single suitcase without being asked and led me to his car, the quiet gesture of help feeling monumental. "Rough flight?" he asked as we pulled away from the curb. I just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He seemed to understand, turning on the radio to a soft classical station and focusing on the road. The town slid by the window, Its familiar storefronts and oak-lined streets feeling alien, as if I were seeing them through a distorted lens. Everything was the same, yet profoundly different. Now that the one person who had made it feel like home was gone. When we turned onto the long gravel driveway leading to the house, George slowed the car. "You sure this is the right place, ma'am?" he asked, a note of genuine concern in his voice. "The front door's open a crack." I looked, and my stomach clenched. He was right. The heavy oak door, the one my mother always insisted be double-locked, was slightly ajar, a dark sliver of invitation to the cold November wind. It was a silent, unsettling welcome. My father and Leo had sworn they would check on the house, collect the mail, make sure everything was secure. Their empty promises echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of my mind. I thanked George, my voice a dry whisper, and pulled my suitcase up the worn stone steps. My own footsteps sounded unnervingly loud. I placed my hand on the door and pushed. It swung inward with a low, mournful creak, opening into a darkness that felt wrong, predatory. The air that washed over me was stagnant and thick, a layered stench of old cigarette smoke, stale beer, and the kind of damp neglect that settles in when a house is no longer a home. It was a smell that had no place within these walls, a home that had always smelled of my mother's lemon polish and the faint, sweet scent of the roses she grew by the porch. My hand fumbled along the wall for the light switch, my fingers trembling. The foyer flickered to life under the weak yellow bulb, revealing a scene of quiet chaos. A mountain of mail had spilled from its brass basket, letters and glossy flyers scattered across the hardwood floor. I could see bills marked "Final Notice," condolence cards from distant relatives, and junk mail addressed to a life that no longer existed. But it was the living room that made my breath catch in my throat. It looked as though a slow, silent tornado had passed through it with malicious intent. The cushions on our floral sofa, the one we'd all piled onto for movie nights, were slashed open, their white stuffing pulled out in ugly, visceral clumps. A half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey sat on the end table, leaving a dark ring on the wood, on the wall above the fireplace, where my mother's prized cross-stitch of a field of daisies had always hung. There was nothing but a faded rectangle of wallpaper and a single naked nail. That cross-stitch had taken her an entire winter to complete, her fingers patiently weaving a landscape of color and life. Now, it was just gone. This wasn't the work of a thief in a hurry. This was an act of violation, a deliberate erasure of her presence. A wave of cold dread washed over me, a physical sensation that started in my gut and spread to my fingertips. I ran up the stairs, each step a heavy thud, my heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. I shoved open the door to my mother's bedroom, praying I was wrong, praying for anything but the confirmation I knew was coming. The scene that greeted me was a desecration. Her mahogany jewelry box, a gift from my father on their 20th anniversary, lay on the disheveled bed, its lid pried open and splintered. It was utterly empty. The strand of pearls she wore to every holiday dinner, the delicate gold locket with my baby picture tucked inside, the simple silver bracelet I'd given her for her last birthday all gone. These weren't just objects. They were artifacts of a life, repositories of memory. Each missing piece was a fresh wound. Every hollow promise my father and brother had made about taking care of things had dissolved into this one. Brutal reality of a ransacked room and a stolen past. My fingers were trembling so violently I could barely unlock my phone. I was trying to dial 911, my mind a fog of panic and rage. The house was deathly silent, except for the frantic thumping of my own heart and the sound of my ragged breathing. And then I heard it. A floorboard creaked in my father's old study, just down the hall. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My blood turned to ice. I wasn't alone. Slowly, a figure emerged from the study's shadowy doorway. It was a man I'd never seen before, gaunt and grimy, his eyes wide and jittery in a way that spoke of desperation. In his hand, He clutched a metal pry bar, the same one he must have used on the jewelry box. He took a shuffling step toward me, a low growl rumbling in his chest, a sound more animal than human. "Get out!" he snarled, his voice raspy and raw. "This is my place now." In that terrifying moment, something inside me snapped. A strange, hot anger surged through me, eclipsing my fear. I wasn't just facing a squatter, a desperate man who had found an empty house. I was facing the physical embodiment of my family's neglect. He was the consequence of their broken promises, the living result of their carelessness. He was here because they were not. The scream that tore from my throat was not one of fear. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, a release of all the grief and frustration and abandonment I had held inside for months. The sound of my own scream was still ringing in my ears when it was answered by the wail of sirens cutting through the night. The man's eyes widened in panic, and he darted back into the study like a cornered animal. Just then, my neighbor from across the street, a woman I only knew by sight, came running up the porch steps, her face pale with alarm. "I saw you go inside the dark house and then I heard the scream," she panted, her phone still clutched tightly in her hand. "I called the police." Two officers entered the house then, their movements swift and professional, their presence a sudden, calming authority in the chaos. They found the man hiding in a closet and led him out in handcuffs without a struggle. As one of the officers took my statement, my neighbor, who introduced herself as Maya, stayed by my side. She pressed a bottle of water into my cold, shaking hand. Her expression was filled not with morbid curiosity, but with a quiet, genuine empathy. She waited until the police had put the squatter in their car. Then she turned to me, her dark, kind eyes searching my face. "Where is your family?" she asked softly. That simple, gentle question did what the flight, the robbery, and the confrontation could not. It broke me. The last wall of strength I had built around myself, a wall I had been reinforcing for years, crumbled into dust. I began to weep, silent, racking sobs that shook my entire body, for my mother, for my home, and for the hollow space where a family was supposed to be. An hour later, I was sitting in the cold, sterile environment of the local police station, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket an officer had given me. This is where my father and Leo finally found me. They didn't rush to my side with words of comfort or relief. They came with faces tight with irritation, as if I were the one who had inconvenienced them. Leo bypassed the officer at the desk and grabbed my arm, pulling me into a corner away from prying ears. His grip was tight, his voice a furious whisper that was more venomous than any shout. "Clara, do you have any idea what this does to Dad's reputation in this town? He's on the board of the Historical Society. Why on earth didn't you call us before you called the police?" I stared at him, dumbfounded. My father stood a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest, nodding in solemn agreement with Leo's whispered tirade. Their first concern wasn't for my safety, or for our mother's violated home. It was for the disruption, for the public relations nightmare. Their only worry was that the carefully constructed facade of their perfect, respectable family was beginning to crack. The truth was an ugly stain they were desperate to contain. What I didn't know at the time, sitting there numb and shivering, was that Maya, my quiet, kind neighbor, was more than just a concerned citizen. She ran a popular local blog and a community Facebook page, a digital town square for our small corner of the world. That night, after she had driven me to a local hotel and made sure I was settled, she wrote a post. She didn't use my name, but the details were sharp and unmistakable. She told the story of a neighbor returning home after laying her mother to rest, only to find her home had been defiled and taken over by a squatter because it had been left abandoned and unchecked for weeks. And then she did something that changed everything. In her state of shock and empathy, I had shown her the text exchange on my phone, a small piece of evidence for my own crumbling sanity. She had taken a screenshot. She posted it anonymously with her story, my simple request for a ride, and Leo's cold corporate dismissal. She ended her post with a simple, powerful question. What does family mean if they're too busy to show up? Within hours, the story caught fire. The hashtag hash. They were busy started trending in local online groups. People I'd never met were sharing the post, expressing outrage on my behalf. And then the offers of help began to pour in. A local cleaning service offered to deep clean the house for free. A locksmith offered to change all the locks at no charge. A downtown diner offered me a standing tab for free meals until I was back on my feet. The outpouring of support from strangers was a tidal wave of kindness, a stark, painful contrast to the cold wall of indifference I had faced for my own blood. I found out when Maya texted me a link to the post with a simple message. I hope this was okay. People needed to know you weren't alone. Reading the dozens of comments, I felt a strange mix of emotions, a flush of public embarrassment, a stab of guilt. But overwhelming it all was a profound, validating relief. The truth was finally out, messy and public and undeniable. The next 3 months were a slow, painful process of rebuilding, both for the house and for my heart. The community, this incredible collection of strangers, rallied around me in a way I never could have imagined. Volunteers scrubbed the cigarette smell from the walls and repaired the slashed furniture. The locksmith changed the locks and installed a new security system. Maya brought over a hot meal nearly every night. They had patched the holes in my home and, in doing so, had begun to patch the holes in my spirit. I sat in the newly cleaned living room, the scent of fresh paint and lemon polish my mother's scent in the air. I was waiting. My father and Leo had requested this meeting, their tone in the text message urgent and conciliatory. They arrived on time, their faces somber and carefully rehearsed. They sat across from me on the restored sofa and delivered their apology. It was a well-crafted speech about how they had been overwhelmed by their own grief, how they hadn't been thinking clearly, and how the entire situation was a terrible, regrettable misunderstanding. Their eyes, however, told a different story. They darted around the room, assessing the repairs, their minds clearly on damage control and how to quiet the lingering gossip that still swirled around them in town. I listened patiently, my hands resting calmly in my lap, when they finally fell silent, an expectant hush filling the room. I didn't offer the tearful forgiveness they were so clearly anticipating. I simply reached for a manila folder on the coffee table. I slid it across the polished wood toward them. "I'm selling the house," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I watched their faces. My father's jaw went slack. Leo's mask of practiced contrition dropped completely, replaced by raw, unfiltered shock. "You can't," he stammered, his voice rising. "This is our family home." He had always assumed it would be his one day, another asset to add to his portfolio, a birthright he never had to earn. I looked him straight in the eye, and for the first time, I felt no anger, no pain, just a vast, quiet distance. "It was Mom's home," I corrected him gently, "and she left it to me." Her will was very clear. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of everything that had been broken, everything that could never be put back together. On the day that would have been my mother's 65th birthday, I stood on a small stage at the town's community center. The room wasn't filled with relatives, but with new friends Maya, the locksmith, the owners of the diner, the volunteers who had helped me reclaim my home. I looked out at their warm, supportive faces, and my heart, for the first time in a long time, felt full in my hands. I held an oversized ceremonial check with the proceeds from the sale of my mother's house and her entire estate, I announced, my voice clear and strong over the microphone. "I am establishing a new foundation in our town. It will be called Eleanor's Door, in her honor." I paused, taking a breath. My mother, Eleanor, always kept our door open for anyone who needed a meal or a kind word. This fund will continue her legacy. It will provide financial assistance for housing, travel, and lost wages for people in our community who need to take time off work to care for a terminally ill family member. It will provide the kind of support that no one should have to beg for, but that everyone deserves. As I spoke, My eyes scanned the crowd and found my father. He was sitting in the very last row, by himself. His shoulders were slumped and in the bright lights of the hall. He looked older and smaller than I had ever seen him. Our eyes met for a long, unreadable moment. I turned my attention back to the room, to the faces of the people who had become my real family. I learned a hard lesson this year, I concluded, my voice steady. I learned that family isn't always about blood. It's about who shows up when it matters most. I didn't say it with bitterness or anger. I said it with the quiet peace of a truth finally and fully accepted. I felt light. I felt free. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that my mother would have been so, so proud. That day, standing on that stage, I didn't feel anger or even sadness. I felt a quiet, profound sense of peace. I had turned a place of abandonment into a foundation of support, transforming my family's failure into a legacy of care that would live on in my mother's name. They had shown me what family wasn't, but in doing so, they had opened my eyes to what it truly could be, not an obligation of blood, but a choice of the heart. I never asked my father why he came to the ceremony that day, and he never explained. Some silences, I've learned, are best left unbroken. My story isn't about revenge, it's about rebuilding. It makes me wonder, have you ever found strength or kindness from an unexpected place when you needed it most? And what does the word family truly mean to you? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, I would be so grateful if you'd like and subscribe. Thank you for listening.